Everybody for this webinar of Mastering SQL Server Migrations, which is actually the first webinar in a series. So we are actually going to have a series of webinars only focusing in migration, SQL Server migration. So this is quite an info package for you. And the webinar series is hosted by SQL Governor, which is a software for automated capacity planning and performance management of the SQL Server estates. So my name is Jani Savolainen, and I'm founder and CTO of SQL Governor. And the next slide is agenda. So first, I'm going to introduce panelists. It takes 5 minutes. There is so many of us. And then we are going to have a kind of panel discussion about 40 minutes. We have reserved 10 minutes for Q&A. And then we're going to have a poll that is having a raffle, and that's optional. Poll is optional, but if you attend, you may win JBL Flip 5 speaker that is awesome sound device. Okay, so first of all, I will tell you a little about Matt. I have known these guys for a long time, so hello guys. Say hello everybody.
Hello everybody.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah, so Matt is a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and he has worked with SQL Server since 2000 version. And he's the leader of the Lexington, Kentucky Pass Local Group and Fragment Domestic and International Community Speaker. And he's also an IDERA ACE alumnus and 2020 friend of Redgate. His original data professional role was a database developer, which quickly evolved into a query tuning work that further evolved into being a full-fledged DBA in a healthcare realm. He has supported several critical systems utilizing SQL Server and managed dozens of 24/7 365 SQL Server implementations. He currently utilizes that real-world experience as a data platform consultant, helping clients design solutions that meet their ever-changing business needs. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
All right, next guy. So Rob works as a consultant for Sewell's Consulting, providing businesses with automation in SQL Server estate management, cloud services, server administration, and providing PowerShell training. Rob works with clients to enable automation, SQL Server best practices, and continuous delivery using PowerShell, Git, VSTS, Jenkins, Octopus deploy mainly on the Microsoft Azure platform or on premises. Rob also enables automation of SQL Server database tasks. He also provides customized training. He is an officer for the Pass DevOps virtual chapter and has spoken at and volunteered at many data platform and PowerShell events. He is a member of the committee that organizes Data in Devon and also the European PowerShell conference. He is a proud supporter of the SQL and PowerShell communities. He releases sharing and learning and can be found doing both via Twitter and in his blog. He spends most of his time looking at the screen and loves to solve problems. He knows that looking at the screen so much is bad for him because his wife tells him so. Thus, you can find him on the cricket field in the summer and flying a drone in the winter. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much.
All righty. And Gianluca is a SQL Server and Oracle DBA based on Conegliano, Italy. Did I say it correct?
Perfect.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Learning my Italian language here. He has worked with SQL Server since version 7 and Oracle since 11G. His interests go from database design and architecture to performance tuning. And he has worked for many years as a Java.NET, Visual Basic and ASP developer, and then decided to focus on the database side of the IT, which is of course great because databases are the best. Now he's working with his own consulting company, SQLconsulting.it. Welcome, Gianluca.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Then a few words about myself. So my name is Jani Savolainen, and I'm founder and CTO of the SQL Governor. I'm also founder of the DB Pro Services, which is a Finnish consulting company focusing into Microsoft Data Platform. Most of my about 20 plus years experience comes from the SQL-centric software development, data warehousing, capacity planning, and consolidation with scientific approach since the version 6.5 of SQL Server. I'm also a chairman of PASS Helsinki local chapter, blogger, and speaker. On my spare time, you can find me writing music, poems, hobbying cars, and playing Texas Hold'em. So I also like lifting weights a bit. So that's about me. All right, then next thing, what we are going to tell you here, what we are going to discuss about, and what are the most important things of migration process as we see it. So the first thing is business impact review. That is a very, very important part of the whole thing to get all the things done in a way that the business is not kind of how would I say, relaying what in a negative way what we are doing. Then it's about the selecting migration tools. Once again, very, very important thing. So we need to know what we are going to do with monitoring and how we are going to review the whole estate of SQL servers, how we are doing the capacity planning and things like that. Requirement specification, technical part of the specification process is very important. Then the capacity planning itself, this is the place that derives most of the cost savings when transitioning to cloud or when renewing the existing architecture or hardware or configuration of SQL servers. Then the detailed specification, migration implementation, and last but not least, the capacity review. So those are the areas that we are going to discuss, and today's session is more like going through all of these on a top level, but the next webinars are going to deep dive in each of these areas. Alrighty. So here you can see canvas, and this canvas is actually split into different, let's say, smaller canvases, subsets of canvas. So we can see that there are like months, first month, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth. And if you are a supplier, there are some inputs that you need to deliver for the customer. And if you are a customer, you can see it there. If you are a customer, actually, it's kind of like supplier plus customer is what you are going to have. So if you are doing it yourself, so you can choose the both fields and both areas basically. And this is just how we see the big picture. It can be in very different way in any of the companies. Then there are outputs that you are going to get as a documents out from the process. So first of all, the first thing that we are going to discuss is actually a business impact review. And as I said, this is very, very important topic. So Matt, why don't you start and tell us a bit about the business impact review?
Yeah, so once you've kind of defined your scope, you need to kind of understand where it fits in, let's say, the corporate IT realm. Like I have a customer right now, we're talking about migrating one piece of software. Database is very large, but it's one piece of software. The catch is it has touch points with probably 30 to 35 other apps. And you have to be aware of all of that. And you have to have people in place that are reaching out to those other teams and saying, you know, here's what we are thinking of doing. Here's the impact we think it may have in terms of, let's say, downtime or maybe limited performance or something like that. And you have to, you know, kind of put that together into a plan. It's doomed to fail if you say we're moving this one app and we're going to do it at this day and time and we're just going to tell everybody and it's going to be fine. that will not go well. You will have a lot of angry people, even if the technical part of the migration goes perfectly. You've interrupted the business, you've angered people you're probably going to have to work with later. And that, that that can get into a downward spiral pretty fast. But it's understanding the impact of that application and looking outside of it, instead of just saying, well, this is this one server and I'm getting the database off of it so I can shut it down so I don't have to pay for it, and I'm moving it over here. There's all kinds of other impacts outside of that, and you really need to consider those first.
Yeah, exactly. How do you see the training evolving this particular concept here?
Well, so there's, I guess the first perspective that comes to mind is, we have a lot more options for migration now than we did, let's say, 10 years ago. Maybe we're moving to another version of on-premise SQL, and then your DBAs probably already have those skills, you'd hope. But maybe you're moving to the cloud, to Azure SQL or something like that. And they need to, at minimum, have an understanding of how those are technically different, that it may not look exactly like what they're used to. So that's an important part. You don't want to migrate to something that's beyond the skill set of the people you have to support it. So yeah, maybe there is some preliminary training or upskilling or whatever kind of buzzword you'd like to use for that, because even if you get on the best technical resource you can, if the people supporting it don't understand how it works or something like that, that's not going to go well for you. So I guess that's the first aspect that comes to my mind. I'm not sure if anything has popped in anybody else's mind.
Yeah, I forgot to say in the beginning of this webinar, but if you have any questions, please chat them all into a chat box, and we are going to use about 10 minutes in the end of the webinar for going through those questions. What pops into my mind is one of the kind of big parts in the business impact review. I think that, as you said, that how things affect each other. So external dependencies would be something to take in account there. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, yeah. So, like I said, kind of you have to take all those touch points into account, and the reason we're talking about this first, and the reason it's on that left side of the chart, is because it's important to do this before you do anything else. You're not into the technical bit at all. Maybe you can have vague conversations around, well, we're going to upgrade to 2019 and move it to that server, or we're going to Azure SQL, but you're not doing anything technical yet, because you don't really know what your options might be, because you have not discussed everything with all the external contact points and other teams and all of that, because there may, not to kind of steal thunder from later, but you may choose ultimately a different way to migrate the data if the external teams say, well, this cutover needs to happen in 5 minutes or less, versus, oh, you can have 2 full days and just let us know when it's back up.
Very good. Still one question about this content, because this is, I think this is pretty important. How do you see the security side of the business impact review?
Critical.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. That's often overlooked, where people are just talking about, well, we want to make sure that this core system doesn't go down, or that the app that we support is not affected by this, or something like that. But you need to make sure that the security posture is sufficient. And at some companies, that means looping in like the security team, and they're going to tell you what you can and can't do and when you can and can't do it. At other places, there is no such team, and so then it's really incumbent on us to make sure that it's done right, that we've considered everything. Just kind of basic stuff. Make sure the server isn't public, make sure your logins are managed right, make sure your auditing set up, and it goes well beyond that. But those are kind of the first things that come to my mind.
Okay, very good.
That's the important part, though, isn't it? The logins. If you're moving an old application, you probably want to take some time to think about who is using it now, because you've probably got logins on from people who were using it 5 years ago. Gathering all of that information is part of that business impact review, because you've got to, if you haven't got the information, you can't then take action on it.
Right,
Yes.
and it's a rare situation where you can just say like, well, we'll just turn it off, or we'll just take their access away and see who screams. In some environments, that's fine, and you're encouraged to do that. In others, that could get you escorted out the door. So it's important to know which kind of environment you're in.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's take another topic then. This is important. Selecting migration tool or migration tools. Rob, why don't you tell us about this one?
So migrating a database or an instance from one SQL Server to another SQL platform is a massive topic. There are, days and days and days of information that you could go through for that. But at this point in your migration progress, you're really considering which sort of tooling that you're going to use. If maybe with Matt's solution, where there is one single large database, maybe it's okay to have somebody do that manually. But if you're in another environment where you're moving 100 instances and each one's got 500 databases, then you definitely don't want to be doing that manually. You want to find a different way to move that forward. So I'm always going to say that you should be using scripts, that they should be in source control, that you should practice them through the environments. Perhaps you're going to use PowerShell. DBA tools is a great method of doing that. You can do a lot of this with T-SQL. But there's other parts of this process as well. If you're moving your databases into Azure, maybe you're moving to Azure SQL Database, maybe you're moving to managed instance. You need to first make sure that your databases are valid to go there. So Microsoft have a DMA tool that enables you to analyze your current workloads and databases and make sure they're compatible with your target platform.
Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty much the case. Would you like to say something about this, Gianluca?
Well, it's not only about understanding how to perform the migration. At this stage, you also have to understand what performance will look like in the target environment. And you need to figure out what kind of performance, what level of performance you need on the target environment, and whether that is acceptable for the end users. So you need to sit down with them and discuss which level of performance they want. And when you're selecting the tools, you also need to select tools that are able to tell you exactly also the performance levels that you have in the source and target environment in order to compare the two and be able to tell whether that is acceptable or not.
Yeah, and that really kind of goes back to the first thing we talked about. And I should have mentioned this. Part of that business impact review is understanding, are there SLAs or something like that that this application operates under? And what's the driving force behind the migration to start with? Has the boss said, okay, we've got to save $1 million on our licensing costs this year, so move everything to the cloud to as low a performance level, as low a service tier as possible? If that's the driving factor, then performance maybe doesn't matter. But if the driving factor is we were just moving to the cloud to modernize some things, and we have an SLA that every transaction has to complete in 1 second, whatever that might be, then that point is exactly right. That's a discussion that's got to happen early, because that's going to dictate a lot of things: the cost of the VM you put it on, the service tier of Azure SQL, what have you. There's also another thing. So DMA is actually a great little tool. But one thing that I've run into a lot on the last 2 projects that I've done is, talking about kind of understanding the holistic app, is we've had issues where the authentication differences between on-prem SQL Server and Azure SQL, the customer's technical staff was not aware of those. So they had scheduled and attempted to execute some migrations without looking at the tool, and their database moved, and then the application could not log in because of the way it likes to authenticate. And that's something that DMA will call out, which is very handy.
Yeah, very, very good points. Okay, so Gianluca actually already told a bit about the monitoring, and I'd also like to say a couple of words about this. So basically, when you're using a monitoring software, it's very important that all the essential data, performance data is being collected from all the servers, instances, databases, and even on data file level. And not only to gather all the essential performance metrics, but also the data collection interval is important. For example, if you take, let's say as a rule of thumb, if you have 1 minute interval on instance and server level hardware utilization, resource utilization, that's very good. Then you can aggregate that, for example, on hour series, on hour level, and then being able to understand that how the system is behaving over time, how the individual databases use resources, how the instances, servers, so forth, use those resources. And Gianluca, I would like to hear, I know this is a favorite topic for both of us, the capacity planning stuff and monitoring stuff. So why don't you tell a bit more about the importance of capturing the monitoring data? What are the kind of things that you should remember when you're doing that stuff, like about key performance metrics, how long you should capture the data, if it's trend-driven data or if it's seasonal or non-seasonal, and things like that?
Well, we're a bit spoiled in the last few years because we've always had the ability to adjust the amount of resources that we can use on our servers. With virtualization, it's easy to say, okay, I will add more CPU if this is not enough, and I will move to a faster tier if this is not good enough. And this has taught us that we can use a reactive approach to migrations, and this is not good. What we should be doing is a proactive approach. We should be capturing performance data in order to know what to expect before we even start discussing the migration. And this has to do with many key performance metrics. I think it's beyond the scope of this webinar to name all the metrics and the counters and everything that builds the baseline. But for sure
we're going to that in the following webinar.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But there are some performance information that you can capture from performance counters or from DMVs, and all of that needs to go into your monitoring baseline. And another thing that is worth mentioning is that you just looking at the data before the migration, you kind of have an idea of what to expect. But this is not guaranteed to be what you will see in the target environment. So it is vital to set up a test environment in the target server and try to replicate the same workload that you have in the source environment in the target environment, so that you don't have to guess what performance will look like. You will know for sure. And this is not non-trivial. This is something that needs some expertise to set up, and it's not easy to do, but it definitely can be done if you know which tools to use and which setups to use for this.
Yeah, exactly. And what comes to like a bigger environments, if you're having a let's say hundreds or thousands of database instances, also kind of monitoring software needs to be scalable to be able to collect that data without sacrificing performance of the source system. So
Yeah.
so that's also, I think, the important thing there. And also, of course, like if there is a seasonal data patterns, it may be that some of the systems, or actually quite many of the systems, may not, if there is lots of servers, are not optimal to well, they are all optimal, of course, to gathering the performance data in a way that you replay the workloads, but also one way would be that you gather a longer term of data, longer period of data, and then you understand the trends and seasonal patterns, and all of a sudden you are able to predict quite well the workloads. Only difference maybe the cardinality estimator change in 2012, I think, if I'm not correct there. So so that changed the workloads, how they behave on the newer version of SQL Server. But after that, it's quite well predictable, at least what I've learned.
Yeah, as you said, the key thing is to capture the whole business cycle, so you can identify things that don't happen every day, but maybe happen at the end of the month, or at the end of the season, at the end of the year. And that is not always easy. So you need to both capture the monitoring data and keep it for a longer window than the one that you use for daily monitoring. And you will use that data to analyze trends. So it's good to downsample that data instead of keeping CPU every 10 seconds. You don't want to do that. You want to aggregate that every hour or every 2 hours and keep that for 2 years, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Every hour or even 4 hours. But the point is that you have some kind of understanding of how the workloads evolve over time. Okay, so next topic is actually technical planning. And so let me open this concept a bit. So basically, it's I would say this like a, maybe like in common language, it would be like requirement specification. And there are two parts in this. It's like a source environment and then the target environment. So kind of the existing state of the SQL estate and then where we are going to. And it has lots of things to go through, like analysis of existing environment, and there are many things like architecture and configurations, OS versions, SQL versions and editions. There are software, as we told earlier on, that gather this kind of stuff. And then also it's good to understand on depending on criticality of server, instance or database, which are the service times and which are the service breaks. That's no brainer, because for example, when doing the capacity planning, you don't want to mess with the kind of outside service time high peaks and make the whole capacity estimates based on those high peaks there. Or if it's a service break, you don't want to get that peaking long time patching there affect the kind of sizing of your environment, especially if you are using, for example, 64 cores. So it's sudden, all of a sudden it may cost quite a lot. So then some other things, like of course, like the environment of development, testing, production, even more environments is relatively typical. And then the service criticality levels, which are more critical servers than the others. And also one can refer to external dependencies, what is being gone through on the business impact review. So that's a good output for input for this part. Then if I would add still something, some other things that are important on this part is like the data center environment pre-study. So all the networking and domains, the hardware, the virtualization, if it's already a hybrid or cloud environment and so forth. And then this is also important, the so-called consolidation analysis. So it's not self-clear that you just lift and shift workloads from here to there. You can do that, but then you may be going to have in many environments into problems when you are in the cloud, because you may have to adjust the workloads again and change the tiers and all that stuff there. So it can take actually time from your uptime even, and it can create some extra costs. So there are things to think about, like which servers are going to be right-sized, which servers are going to be virtualized, if there is instances to be consolidated against managed instances, like a smaller long tail instances, or against the ISVMs. Of course, like, are you going to AWS or Azure or so forth? And then the databases to be redistributed within the instances if they are not equally balanced in between the instances. So all this kind of stuff you can play with, and all of a sudden save tens of % in your licensing and hardware or cloud costs. Lifecycle planning, SQL Server diagnostics, and health check is very good idea to do before the migration, because you may end up having totally different kind of baselines. So that should be done actually like on iterative way. And then the risk analysis is also important. Do you have, guys, any other things to mention here on like a source environment technical planning?
Well, I think, like you said, and it kind of goes back to what we were chatting about earlier. It's important to understand, what's the motivation for the migration to start with. A lot of businesses right now are obviously trying to save costs where they can, and consolidating your data estate can be a very good way to do that. SQL licenses are expensive. But right, you need to go in with all the proper information, and like you said, even consider if you're going to put databases together that haven't been together before. Consider, do they all have the scheduled downtime? Like if they have a maintenance window, is it all the same? Is it all different? So maybe those shouldn't be combined in the way that makes the most technical sense. But yeah, I think it's, this is the perfect time before you've actually executed it to consider consolidating, even if that's not one of the goals, because that's going to make you look good. Then you can go to your boss and say, hey, we achieved this goal of moving this over here, moving to the cloud or whatever. And oh, by the way, as a part of that, I've saved you, $40,000 a year on licensing costs or something like that. And that's, not only a proactive thing to do, which is what we should all be striving for, but if you're putting money back in the company's pocket, sometimes that can result in a bit of that finding its way to yours, which is always nice.
Yeah, and I think that's super important, that as you mentioned, that the redistributing the workloads and consolidating, there is a couple of things that always occur in these projects. So you need to be aware of operating system, of course. Operating system version is one of the kind of things that is going to restrict what are you going to consolidate and what are you not going to consolidate, for example, on instance level or on database level, from databases to instances. Then there is like, as you said, the let me think about a second here. Another thing is like if you are having a different criticality levels, and then if you have a certain service breaks configured or set from the business perspective. So all these things actually all of a sudden they affect that how you are able to do the consolidation. Then a little bit about the target specification. So okay, Rob, we cannot hear you now.
I'm a professional. I've done this lots of times.
Yes,
so one of the other things that you really need to consider at this point is not just the SQL instance itself, but the things that are connecting to it. You got to make sure that you've got compatibility with the target solution that you're going to have. You will find that there will be third-party applications that you're using that will not connect to Azure SQL database in their current setting. So there are all sorts of validations that you'll need to perform on those to make sure that they can go through, because we've talked a lot about saving money Obviously, the risk with the cloud is that it's really easy to spend money, far easier than it used to be. It used to be we had to have go through a purchasing process where we would have to buy hardware that would get authorized and then delivered and then installed. Whereas now you can literally just do that and cost your company $20,000, $40,000, $50,000. It really can go very quickly into large amounts. So if you are comparing the cost of your source and your target, always remember to include the cost of those additional factors you might need in Azure. You might be using a file share for a landing place for some ETL, and now you need to have that in Azure. That's going to add some cost. There's other things to consider, and doing them at this point enables you not to have sudden panics in month 5, 6 when you're trying to actually do the migration itself.
Well,
Exactly.
and that's where understanding that performance target can be so important, because I've seen a migration happen. It's successful. The workload analysis wasn't done. And 2 or 3 weeks in, all of a sudden, it kind of hits that tipping point and falls over. And if it's in the cloud, a lot of times it's quite easy to just double the RAM, double the cores, whatever. But you're increasing your licensing costs significantly to fix the problem because you didn't do the homework up front.
Yeah, so exactly. If you're gonna lift and shift, you have to know the caveats, kind of dangers there. So if you want to make it optimally, it would be maybe better idea to already do the capacity planning before making transition to cloud or renewing the hardware or things like that. So that's always a bit of like a brave move to make lift and shift, but that can be done in some of the cases as well. Okay, what I want to say also is when you're defining the target architecture there, it's like non-functional requirements are also important: scalability, availability, performance, security, so on, maintainability, of course. And then defining the architecture alternatives. Can we change something? For example, if we were having a simple standalone machines, we have had problems with service levels, uptime, things like that. Maybe we would deploy FCIs, always on solutions, go to cloud using managed instances, things like that. What is going to IIS, PaaS, DBS, so forth. And also, of course, the calculating the initial capacity, as we discussed, would be a good part of this kind of to finalize the technical planning here. And doing some cost model pre-study, that's also important to understand the licensing. So it would be a good idea to have some kind of somebody who knows better about licensing and how to optimize that stuff. And that's the like different art totally. So that's something that also should be considered. And of course, then select the desired end architecture. Okay, so next I'm going to have next topic. So okay, so this may be something that I want to say a couple of words about, and then let Gianluca, Matt, and Rob, you guys tell there more about this. But the capacity planning itself, it's first you have to understand, and that's why you have to do the requirements specification, so technical planning, that what to right size, what to virtualize, what to consolidate, so forth. And what do you need to know in capacity planning? You need to know actually the benchmark levels of the existing source hardware and virtual machines and the database, so forth. So for example, if you have you can use, for example, spec.org benchmarks, which is one of the very well-known benchmark places. So they have the benchmarks like average throughput, integer calculation in CPU processing power of each server. And then all of a sudden, when you have these numbers, you're able to start to calculating, okay, what if I change the workload from here to there, renew the hardware, things like that? How would I be able to save and optimize or even increase the performance on those servers and so forth? So that's one part of it. Then, of course, understanding the trends, the time series of monitoring data, and then you need to be able to understand those service times, service breaks, and also in the consolidation, you would be able to use a bit more complex logic, like what instances or databases to stack together and so forth. So that's a kind of a totally different kind of point to use. And of course, there is also software for this kind of stuff, for example, as SQL Governor. But Gianluca, would you like to tell more about this topic? I know that you're also you have done lots of this stuff with your workload tool. So why don't you tell more about this?
Well, yeah, the main issue with relying on someone else's benchmarks is the fact that they are not taken from your workload. So the only way to know for sure how your workload is going to perform on a target system is to try it. And there are not many tools for this, but as you mentioned, one of the tools around for SQL Server is called Workload Tools. And this is a creature of mine that you can find on GitHub. So this is open source software. And you can use it to capture a workload. You can filter it according to your needs and decide to point it to your target environment. And this will tell you how your workload is going to perform in the target environment, so you can compare the source and the source and the target, and see if performance is what you would like it to be. And there are also other tools for this. Microsoft has a couple, like DEA, the Database Experimentation Assistant. It kind of had a rough start as a tool. It was a bit hard to use in the beginning, but now it is getting better and better, and it is built by Microsoft, so there's some serious work behind. And again, it can capture a workload, analyze it, and can replay the same workload against test database. It also helps you coordinate the backups that you need to set up the target environment so that it reflects exactly what you had in the source.
Yeah.
And there are many things that you can catch by using tools like that. So you can catch regressions on the whole workload or even on a single query. And that's probably something you want to capture before you perform the actual migration. It also helps you find stuff that stops working altogether, which is also good to catch before you execute the migration.
Yeah, Gianluca, let me challenge you a bit in one part of this topic. Yes, we all know that the performance may vary on an environment basis, but if you are not going to change the SQL Server version when you're doing migration planning or transitioning the workload to cloud, and then you still know the benchmarks like the CPU, what is the RAM, and you know the I/O characteristics and things like that. And basically, the good side in monitoring-based capacity planning is that you can take really long time of performance counters. So understand very well the behavioral characteristics of those workloads. So basically, in such case where you are not upgrading to this critical 2008, 2012 or higher level, you actually get very good numbers. I have had dozens of these cases with the capacity planning, our capacity planning software SQL Governor, and we never faced a problem where we had kind of guessed the totally wrong capacity. So how would you say about that? Is it always really needed there, or how do you see?
Well, in some cases for applications that are really performance critical, I think you at least need to get a stab at doing it. In some cases, I agree with you that it's pretty predictable what you will get, even changing the slightest thing on the environment has unpredictable effects on query performance, like even touching the amount of RAM available can have very big effects on the optimization level and
Yes.
shape of the plans.
So I would never decrease RAM.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would
but
never decrease RAM.
consolidating
Yeah.
a lot of databases to the same environment can, in a way, decrease RAM if more applications and more workloads are fighting for the same amount of resources. So it's something that you always have to take into account. And if you don't want to test it down to the simulation and replay, at least take it into account.
Yes, exactly. And the combinations of both kind of aspects is like the best ever, of course. If you have both aspects, like you are having the monitoring driven and then workload driven points of view. So it's just they are like a how would I say giving even more information. So that's always better. Okay.
Since you mentioned it, I wanted to say something about the versions that people often overlook. Microsoft is certifying the compatibility at the database level. So even if your database, even if your application vendor does not certify their software for version X, if you keep the compatibility level at the database, you can move that safely, even without their consent.
Yeah. All right. So time is running, so let's get into a next topic here, and that would be actually well, actually, I would like to ask something about when we are talking about capacity planning. Matt and Rob, why don't you say something about compatibility levels here before we proceed to the next topic?
Well, I think that was pretty well said. I wish, honestly, the documentation was a bit clearer because some vendors are stubborn, and if you have to get their consent to move it, like if it's under a support agreement or something like that, some of them will dig their heels in and say, well, I don't care what the Microsoft documentation says, that's not clear to me. We're certified against SQL Server 2014 Service Pack 2 or whatever it is. But that is important to understand, and you're starting to see the messaging around this change where we're all used to the box product and like it's 2017, it's 2019, it's whatever it is. But inside Microsoft, and increasingly the way they talk about it outside, compatibility level is what we should be focused on. And that is a point well taken, that you may have a database that's in 2014, it's a server you'd like to shut off, maybe the data center is going away or something like that. You could move it to a 2019 box, set the compatibility level appropriately, and you'll get the security improvements that have come with the later version, but the database will behave as it's supposed to. You should still test that.
Yeah, of course. Testing is always good, and also what is my experience on this after 2012? It's not that unpredictable, those workloads there. So, but let's go to next topic then. It's about detailed specification. So I think that if Matt, because you're on fire already, why don't you continue here? So tell us a little about detailed specification on migration implementation, like maintenance, patching, performance, something like that.
Well, and so that's going to matter a lot depending on what your target is, right? If you're going to a platform as a service offering, managed instance, Azure SQL, whatever, a lot of that is taken care of for you. Now, it's not all magic. There's still some things you need to look at and stuff like that. But right, it is important not only to plan out what the technical specs of the target are and make sure you've tested your workload against that and make sure that it performs right and all of that, but the supportability going forward, like you said, you have to define that. What maintenance jobs will we be doing? Will we be adding some, taking some away? Like I said, on PaaS stuff, that changes quite a bit, frees you up to do some different things. But yeah, you should plan for the future. Once it's landed, you're not done. You're still supporting everything. You're just not actively migrating anything.
Okay.
I agree. I had a 1.5 hour meeting booked to begin to understand how we could order the patching for the new environment. And I went into the meeting and I said, it's all PaaS, Microsoft takes care of it. That was the end of the meeting because it was done. But the other side of that is that normally when you're migrating to things that are quicker and better, whatever sort of hardware it is that you're going on. Sometimes you can have problems if your processes finish too quickly. So if you've got something that sits in a daily cadence and goes through, and suddenly your new process runs in 2 hours, whereas before it used to run in 8 hours, and then it kicks off the next thing, suddenly things can get out of sync. So whilst that fits kind of into Gianluca's workload and performance monitoring, because you want to see if things are improving, but just because you improve something on this side doesn't mean that on the other side you're not going to have some impact, and that can come down to a micro level as well, in that if your really big long query suddenly runs much quicker, then maybe there's a whole load more of them and you're getting a different issue on your instance. These are all things that you've got to understand and look out for in this beginning process when you're evaluating and understanding the entire piece.
This is where you put a sleep in your code to wait and simulate the old slow system.
Yeah.
You're an expert.
I think the next step would be to go to migration implementation. We are a bit running out of time here, so let's try to be brief. That is not our second name or even third name. So about the migration implementation, Rob, why don't you tell us a bit about this, about like how important is the automation, for example?
Automation is vital. Without automation, you cannot repeat what it is that you're going to do, unless you're in a very particular place where you're only moving one single environment instance database. You're going to be repeating steps. Every time that you're repeating steps, then use some sort of form of automation. Well, you know, with a few minutes left, I don't think we have enough time to really be able to explore that properly, but I'll just say automation is king.
Yeah, okay, that's good. So the next thing would be capacity review. So just to summarize it with a few words, it basically means that you have the foundation information and feedback information. So basically you have to monitor all your source environment, like servers, instances, databases, how they behave, and then when you make the migration, you can compare the same instances, databases, how they're performing, and cross-checking kind of with KPIs that how they are they worse or better or anywhere in between. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what's in the capacity review. And then we had actually said the last thing here that would cover the politics, but I would say if we are going to speak politics, it would last too long. So let's put that politics discussion, for example, in the beginning of next webinar in a series that is going to appear around 4 to 6 weeks, I would say so. But then it's time for the questions. So now I'm going to see the chat box. Is there any questions? There seems to be you can write them in the chat box. Now I don't see any questions yet here.
So I just wanted to make one quick point. You know, we've talked about it kind of being once the migration's implemented, you've reviewed what you've done, you've documented it, that it ends. And I think one of the things, you should always be doing it on-prem, but uniquely to the cloud, we have the ability to turn the horsepower up and turn the horsepower down. So having this as kind of a rolling process, I think makes sense, because it may be that some of the apps, the developers are optimizing their code and you need less, fewer resources than you did. So I think having this as kind of a regular process, like they say, the easiest way to save money in the cloud is to turn off the stuff you're not using. Understanding that maybe all the RAM and CPU you thought you needed, you only need 60% of it now because they've rolled out a new version that's much better. That's something we should probably be doing as a regular process. Even though the migration's over and maybe we're not moving anything for years, we can still add or take away resources as we need.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's one problem with an incremental approach, that often you leave some pieces of the pie behind. And imagine a system where there's an ETL that runs once a month and needs to work on the database. The rest performs fantastically in the cloud, and that process remains on-prem, and it will get higher latency on the cloud. So things like that, when you use an incremental approach, need to be taken into account.
Yeah. Also, one thing to kind of think about the capacity planning is that if you have a big estate, tens of servers, hundreds of servers, or even thousands of them, and especially if you are limited in time and you want to migrate rather than in months or even more, just within like a few weeks. Of course, you need to first gather some data or take the monitoring data out of that and make a capacity planning. Then automated capacity planning and consolidation software is excellent tool there, because you save a lot of time. Instead of doing weeks and months of very complex calculations, you can do it within a days. So that's also something that where you can save a lot of time and effort, and being able to understand like a 95% probability that what is the needed workload there on those servers and instances. But now it's time to move to next step, and that would be poll. So now you're going to, when you're ending this session, you're getting a poll of a few questions, and this JBL Flip 5 portable speaker, Bluetooth speaker is being raffled there. So that's something that you may like to win there. And you can follow us on Twitter when we discuss and sometimes debate on what we are doing. So there is Matt, Gianluca's, Rob's, and my Twitter handles. So SQL at Speed, Spaghetti DBA, SQL DBA with the bird, and Cyber Sigma. So those are our Twitter handles. And this is the information of SQL Governor if you're interested in automated capacity planning, consolidation planning of your estate, SQL estate. So we have European Union and USA patented software here doing these tricks. So
looks like we have some questions, Jani.
There is now a question. Okay, we have time for a question before the poll, like one or two. Open the question mark. Oh, where it is? I cannot see it here. Who sees it?
I don't.
Open the question mark. Now I'm stupid maybe.
No, I don't see it either.
Oh, there. I think I found it. There are many questions. Oh no. Okay. So first one is, sorry about this. Let's use a couple of minutes for these questions, and let's do so that, because we are not going to be able to answer all these questions. So if we can use your contact information, I think we do a bit like burning midnight oil, and we answer your questions and send to email for you if that is okay.
They might make a great blog post too.
Blog post is better idea. Let's compose a blog post of this. But one thing that is Okay, this I can ask. Okay. So the hardest part is functional testing. Any tips on that? That's a very good question. Who wants to answer?
Well, I guess I can take it. Functional testing needs to go through all the queries that you run on your server and run them again against the target environment. So they will either work or fail, and they will either be faster or slower than the ones you have in the source environment. And that's where tools like workload tools can help you.
Yeah, exactly. Very good question and very good answer. So then two questions still. Are there any downsides relying on database compatibility levels? Looking for any gotchas?
So according to Microsoft, no, they stand behind it. Like we said earlier, if it's certified against the box product version and it's compatibility level 130, then that compatibility level in any subsequent box version should work the same. And they've even said if there's a bug, you know, if you identify a bug in that, Microsoft will handle that at obviously no cost to you and those sorts of things. So they stand behind it pretty firmly. You should still test it because, you know, software does have bugs. SQL Server is really good and really stable, but it's not perfect. So that testing, all the testing that leads up to actually executing this is still very important, even though Microsoft's using pretty strong language and what they say they'll do.
Thank
also,
you.
there's ESBs that refuse to take responsibility for that. So they always tell you, no, that's the version of the server we need.
Yeah. So the next, the last question is that do you recommend Azure migration service for SQL migration? That's actually second last question.
I've had fairly good experience with DMS, but it's imperfect. I would generally prefer, and I think this goes back to what Rob said, I'd prefer to use my own scripts, my own things that I've put together, but sometimes that's not always a good option if you're moving a lot and if you're kind of guiding a whole team. It probably is best to use the Microsoft tools. They're okay. I would say the one problem I've run into with DMS is as you start getting into larger databases, it can struggle. I know they're improving that, but it's not well. And another thing, as far as using DMS to migrate to like Azure SQL or something, you need a strong Azure person as well, because there is some networking voodoo that needs to be done. And if the DBA can do it, great. Generally, though, there's like an Azure architect or somebody on staff that probably should be handling that. That's not us. And it's important to loop that person in early in the process because they get grumpy when you're like, hey, I'm migrating a thing tomorrow and you need to provision me this resource and do all the networking setup. And it's scheduled to go in 8 hours. That's not going to go well for you.
All right, the last question. Can you tell us about the parallel migration? Does that say anything to anyone?
Doesn't ring a bell, sorry.
Yeah. I don't recognize this. We can get back to this. Maybe you have an extra question if you understand. Put more info about what was the question, and then we are able to answer it later on. But now we are running out of time.
Or they can tweet to us too.
Yes, you can tweet us, and now we are running out of time. So about 4 to 6 weeks, we are going to have next webinar about next topic inside the migrations of SQL estates. Thank you so much for attending, and sorry that it went a few minutes later, but we hope that it was good information for you. And now you can go to Paul after this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.